all I can come up with, it's sort of the best of times and the worst of times. I mean, I think what the Trump administration gave us is, if I don't think there was a silver lining, but if there was a silver lining, it gave us several things. One is a mirror into ourselves, which we have to understand. Particularly white people in this country have to understand what our own history is.
Mm.
And it also gave us a giant civics lesson. And I see that with my own children. Millennials, Gen Xers are much, much more politically engaged
Mm.
and educated than earlier generations who were taking a lot of things for granted. And in life, we can't take anything for granted. And I think that's about our individual behavior, how we treat each other, but it's also global.
Hi, my name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, a podcast and also a live video event on Facebook where it's first seen, and then it goes to YouTube, and then about 4 or 5 places where podcasts are listened to. My guest today is Martha Ann Toll, who is a novelist who's written a book we'll be talking about, an NPR book critic or writer. She's been in the Washington Post, Pointe Magazine, et cetera, and we're going to get into all that. And the book that we're going to be talking about today is a novel called Three Muses. And I should either put my glasses on or peer at this thing here that was shortlisted for the Gotham Book Prize and won the, can you tell me how to pronounce this?
It's the Petrichor Prize for finely crafted fiction.
Okay,
And
good.
for
All
you
right.
wordies out there, petrichor means the smell of grass after a
Yeah.
rainstorm.
Okay, there you go. So that's the stuff. So I'm going to begin at a weird place. I saw on your website, I think it was, a picture of you writing, and you're sitting in kind of a wicker chair with your feet up on a little stool, bending over what looks like a coffee table, peering at a laptop. And since I write too, I want to know, is this really your posture for writing, or is that just a picture?
No, I was really writing when that picture was took, but about 3 friends of mine wrote me and said you needed a major yoga class and
Yeah.
advice about sitting. I'm usually sitting slightly better than that. That was in a rental house and that was my weird office setup. But I do write on a laptop and I haven't written longhand forever. So
Yeah,
I
well, I was going to get Ernie to get scrape together the pennies to donate you a chair and a desk, but I guess we don't have to. It was
no,
like, no,
I have
no,
a good chair.
she's going to need chiropractic assistance after every writing session, if that's how she's writing her books, because I get up early in the morning and write too. So I want to begin at a different place. We're going to talk about the book, but let me start somewhere else. In the last line of the novel, which is in fact your acknowledgement page, you have a line in there about your 2 daughters and your husband, and you finish off kind of poignantly, and I want to get this right, because it's beautifully stated, and it's sort of where I always read acknowledgements because that's where the book ends. My daughters Leah Becker and Naomi Becker, and my husband Dan Becker, without whom, comma, nothing. And that's a beautiful sentence, by the way. I just think that's wonderfully constructed. But let me begin there, because I find when I interview people about a work of fiction, that what is most interesting about it, after you say it's a good book, I enjoyed reading it, and the kind of things you see in blurbs, you can either spend an hour trying to tell the story, well, you might as well read the book, or ask questions about the story, as this will sound odd, as if it's a work of nonfiction, which I'm going to do, like it actually happened, because that's the way I take fiction in a way. But the other thing that I really want to delve into is the author, because I think what's interesting about fiction is the how and why and who and when. And then, of course, there's 2 ways to get to know somebody who's a professional writer or garbage collector or doctor or anything. And that is, one, to do this typical thing of what do you do? And then you're supposed to say, I'm a writer and I've won these prizes and my stuff's on NPR and here are the books I reviewed. But I think a much more interesting question, which is what I want to do in this podcast, and I do with all my guests, is not what do you do, but who are you? Because in essence, that's where the novel came from. So who are you that you wind up writing a passionate love story in a way? Who are you where you are rooting something back into years in which you were not alive, because we're talking about the 40s an event in the Holocaust, the kind of progression. You did do ballet, you studied ballet, you're passionate about ballet and music, as I am, by the way. I never did ballet, especially since I had polio when I was 2 and one of my legs is atrophied. But other than that, I want to know where all this comes from. So let's just sort of unpack the book. It's rooted back in World War II. It is about ballet. And by the way, I know this is weird the way I'm introducing this, it's all over the place, but let me just tell you something that really jumped out at me. A line in the book that I want to sort of get into to start with, but I want to read it correctly because I was very struck by that because it mirrored a thought that I've often had about Mozart. Mr. Yankov waved at Lydia to stop. And then this is my quote: "The Requiem was unfinished at Mozart's death," Worthington said, "which makes it an elegy to the composer himself." And I just thought that was terrific because I've always thought that, and I've always wondered how that. So here's where I'll start. That line typifies a book that is rich with cultural knowledge and love of art and music. You and I really share that. I love that you take art and music seriously enough to essentially write a novel about it, which I think it's more about than the characters, if I could put it that way. So who are you? Where does this come from? You took ballet. You have a wonderful tribute to your parents and their writing and your mother's editing and all the rest of it, and your dad's love of the written word. So I sort of know a little bit of who you are, but I'd like you to talk about your life and your passions that led to the writing of this book. That's awfully broad. I hope that's not too broad.
That's fine. I've been listening to you really carefully. So first, I'm just going to show our viewers, this is the cover of the book.
And I apologize, I don't have it to hold up because
No, that's fine. I just want people to see it. It's called Three Muses.
Yes.
And I'm going to start with the last line of the acknowledgments. So let's talk about family. I have 2 adult daughters named Lila and Naomi, my husband Dan. And so family is the root for all of us. And this book is also, in my opinion, about kinds of love. There's a lot of fraught love. There's love that doesn't work. There's mother love, passionate love between 2 people. And so I grew up in a very, very secular Jewish family, secular to the point of I was essentially not educated in the Jewish religion, but like other Jewish people of my generation, particularly in America, very, very culturally warm, rich, extended family, love of food and people and books and culture. So I had a very, very rich upbringing. I'm extremely grateful for my most of them are ancestors, not all of them. My elders, I had loving elders, aunts and uncles who were incredibly important to my upbringing. So I feel like those are where my roots are. I spent a career in social justice, and my work in social justice was to I'm a lawyer. I ran a philanthropy that gave money away to anti-death penalty work, criminal injustice, I call it, and housing and homelessness. And I bring that up because I have had the fortunate experience of having my work dovetail with my values, and many of us are not that fortunate. But I was, and I'm now writing full time, which is a great joy. And my book, Three Muses, is a deep look at the Holocaust. It very briefly tells the story of a Holocaust survivor who survived when his mother told the commandant that he was a little boy, he could sing. And so he survives by singing for the commandant of the camp that murdered his family. And this is a terrible dilemma. He comes to the United States, ultimately becomes a psychiatrist. The healer needs to heal himself first. So this is a book about healing and love. And he falls in love with a ballerina named Katya Simonova, and she, unbeknownst to him, is in a very, very complicated, fraught, abusive relationship with her choreographer. But there's some love in there too. So that's the framework. People always ask me about three muses, and these 3 things are deeply important to me. The first is song and music. The second is discipline, and part of the discipline in the Greek tradition is the meaning of preparation for prayer. So song is loosely associated with John, discipline is loosely associated with the ballerina Katya, and then memory is the third and most powerful muse. And I have spent much of my adult life thinking about memory, both my own memories and how they can inform my work, but also the collective memory of the Jewish people. We don't build cathedrals. We are people whose memory and written word has sustained us over 4,000 years.
One thing I just want to note on the way through is that, you know, for instance, in the Theresienstadt camp, which is not part of your book, this thing of not just children, but adults as well, performing for their captors was standard practice for the Nazis, who had this weird thing of both placing an officially high value on the performing arts, all the way to the point of taking half of the Berlin Symphony and having them essentially entertain them while they were killing other Jews.
Yes.
And so forth. And so it's a huge, you know, you've tapped into something that's not only a real thing,
right.
It's a shockingly typical thing, especially for those humanists like myself who look to the arts as a sort of, you might say, civilizing and passion curbing and hate, you know, modifying form. You know, I was asking my producer, Ernie, the other day, I said, you know, we were talking about the Trump years and where we're at and so forth. And we do this a lot because I interview all kinds of people and I've been a spokesperson in that area myself. And I was saying, well, you know, what was the good of all the fiction? You know, Huxley and Orwell, everybody all the way down, you know, everything warned us about this, and art has achieved nothing. And I'm not saying I really believe that. I was in a kind of a dark humor, but I really wonder that about these things. You know, you take this child who performed for the Nazis and this, you know, there's sort of, but what's going on the planet right now doesn't place this in the past, because whether it's Hindu nationalism and the rise of what's going on, Modi and his violence against Hindus and Christians, the sanctioning of it, what is going on across the planet in our own. I know this is a huge leap, but I've read your stuff about Nina Totenberg, and I've actually, it's so funny when, you know, you get a thing, I didn't realize you're the same person until I was looking at your bio today, and I've been reading your things anyway. I've been reading reviews of yours for a long time in different places. One review you wrote many years ago, I forget in detail, that I remembered when I remembered who you are, or Cotton, this is the same person, was you wrote a review about children being incarcerated. A book. And it just seems to me that in your social consciousness and in the reviews you've done of other people's work, and then somehow your point of departure being a child who performs for the Nazis and then, you know, has problems later, as your novel indicates, in terms of just the continuous use of his voice when it's already been put to this other use and the damage it did him. I'm just wondering how you look at what I would call the rise of a new theocratic movement globally, which is whether it's Hindu nationalism or the Wahhabists in Saudi Arabia or the Iranian morality police or the white Christian nationalist movement that I come out of and fled and have written about. I think this all has something to do with your point of departure in the novel, because history is repeating itself. So kind of a two-pronged question. What's the use of art, since all the warnings seem to have fallen on deaf ears? Combined with you as a Martha, as a critic and a social observer involved in justice issues, how do you see our moment?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Frank, for all the beautiful work that you've done. I read up about your work. It's extremely important for those of us who have a platform to speak. I believe that's part of our justice work. And I realized, I mean, I was writing a story, but I realized when I had finished, it took me 10 years, I thought a lot about this. I realized that it's incredibly contemporary, because you're right, bigotry is everywhere in our society. And it's very, very dangerous, as we can see everywhere. There's, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement has given voice to the violence against Black bodies. We have a lot of anti-Muslim folks. We've seen the rise of anti-Semitism in this country. And so I think your question was about our present moment. So I am so deeply immersed in the arts. My next book, called Duet for One, is an immersion into music. So it's funny that I struggle to answer your question. I don't think I've never written fiction with a mission,
Hmm.
even though what fiction does for us is show us our own humanity
Hmm.
and our own flaws and hopefully provoke some conversations. And hopefully, like I always say, all of the statistics on the Holocaust are impossible to absorb. So let's tell the story of one person because it
Hmm.
may make meaning.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, history repeats itself, but I also, and it's terrifying and really upsetting.
Hmm.
And I wish we had better history instruction in our schools here in America. And I think fundamentalism scares me of any religion. I don't have I think across the board, when somebody thinks they have a direct connection to God and no one can question what they're saying, that's tough to argue with.
Yeah.
And it's tough to reason. I'm not so much argue as reason. And we need to be reasonable people. We're not. We're a greatly emotional people.
Hmm.
So I take a lot of, I guess, solace advice from the writer Rebecca Solnit.
Hmm.
And she put, a lot of people have said this, but I happen to remember that she said it, which is, I don't have time to be a pessimist.
Hmm.
And if I'm overly optimistic, that's a waste of time too. We have a short period of years in this life and we have to do what we can do. And that's all I can come up with. It's sort of the best of times and the worst of times. I mean, I think what the Trump administration gave us is, if I don't think there was a silver lining, but if there was a silver lining, it gave us several things. One is a mirror into ourselves, which we have to understand. Particularly white people in this country have to understand what our own history is.
Hmm.
And it also gave us a giant civics lesson. And I see that with my own children. Millennials, Gen Xers are much, much more politically engaged
Hmm.
and educated than earlier generations who were taking a lot of things for granted. And in life, we can't take anything for granted. And I think that's about our individual behavior, how we treat each other, but it's also global.
Hmm.
It's also global. So
It's
I
interesting.
can't, so I'm married to a climate activist.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah. You guys are like
Hard to,
almost stereotypically liberal,
I know,
nice people. Like it's as if,
recovering.
come on, not a climate activist, not on top of
Yeah.
all your social justice stuff. And that too, I mean, please.
Yeah, so he's always been an optimist. I can almost not talk to him about his work because I'm so panic stricken. But
Yeah.
what choice do we have? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not a person who feels we should give up. I have children. I hope to have grandchildren someday.
Yeah, I
We,
agree.
we have to we have to do what we can do in our limited lives.
Rebecca Solnit the other day was writing something that I read with great interest because it was really out of her usual purview. I forget the piece, but it was a little piece she wrote, maybe for The Guardian. I forget where I read it. Was or maybe it was her letter that you get, when you subscribe. But she was talking about the fact that while she is not a religious person, she was sort of mourning the loss of church going, only from the practical point of view of the lack of community.
Community, yeah.
And I thought it was really out of character for her, but it's also a kind of an indication of the temper of our times that, we're all so worried about the next generation and the lack of community and togetherness. And I'm just wondering, tapping into I come from as churchy a background as you can get, and I left it. I'm always fascinated to talk to people who come from a very different background. And again, this is who wrote the book, The Three Muses, because this gets to who you are. I journeyed away from my fundamentalist evangelical Christian background. I'm now in a very different place, spiritually, emotionally, politically, and so forth. I made enemies. I had family members who didn't speak to me, and the journey has been costly. But I'm always interested in people's journeys. So you came from a very kind of non-religious background. One that one of my sons married into, because his wife, my daughter-in-law, comes from a very similar background to yours, by just, cursory what I know of you, sort of educated, secular, Jewish, American, that whole experience. So we have a little bit of a family connection there, but I'm just curious, where's your own journey taken you where today, a little snapshot of where you are today, Martha, is different than, say, when you were 12, 15, 18, 20, 23, or newly married, pre-child, pre-children, post-children. How have your views changed and developed?
Yeah, well, I think I always came from a very strong value system, so that hasn't changed. But I felt by the time I had gotten to my teens and I had had very deep interactions with Holocaust survivors. I mean, I'm related to them.
Right.
And I'm from a generation where the parents of my friends were Holocaust survivors. People would come to our Thanksgiving with tattoos on their arms. I mean, I was very aware of it. So first of all, to have the Holocaust be your first introduction to Judaism, or an early introduction to Judaism, is somewhat fraught and very meaningful also. But I felt somewhat rootless. I began to feel, particularly by the time my late teens, the time I got to college, I felt like I come from a very long tradition that has a lot of history and I better learn about it. So I did it, I've since that time, since you said age 12, certainly since age 12, maybe even earlier, I have been reading and discussing and trying to understand what it means to be a Jewish person in the 20th and the 21st century. I don't have a lot of answers, but I think what I feel is I wanted my own children to be rooted. We gave them a Jewish education. And my feeling is, you make your own choices, but it's hard to make a choice if you don't have the education. So I feel very open-minded. And I think the core of all world religions is love and family and peace. And we get very far away from that. As we get deeper and deeper into organized religion. So I'm like most Jewish people that I know, extremely conflicted. I mean, that's what I would say. And we come from a tradition that is embedded. If you think of Moses questioning God, we come from a questioning, not quite shaking your fist at God, but a questioning religion. And the doubting and the questioning is in our faith. So in that way, it's convenient. What can I say? I feel very comfortable being a Jewish person, even though I'm still not particularly observant, because of that duality, the dialogue that we have to have each generation about what does faith mean and what is our role in the world and what is our purpose as human beings.
A moment ago, you were talking about the fact that numbers, 6 million, whatever, tough to get your head around. The individual story tells more. And of course, I think that's a great strength of Three Muses, in the sense that you're following this individual story. And another great strength of Three Muses is that you're following this story with roots back into the Holocaust. That is not a way of examining the Holocaust, but the humanity of the people who came out of that, which I think is very strong and ties in with what you said a moment ago, that you don't write a sort of politically or a philosophically driven narrative to kind of make a point. You're not doing an Animal Farm or something that's on the nose. You're doing, but at the same time, you're relying on the human story rooted in a period of history to humanize everyone who comes out of that. And I'm not saying that's the purpose of the book, but it's certainly something that happens that I think makes the book much stronger than if you wrote, a very on-the-nose book to try to retell what Elie Wiesel says, but in fiction or something. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know. Is that a good?
I really appreciate that. And Elie Wiesel obviously had his experience. You have to come to this topic with tremendous humility. And it's a very fragile topic to write about. I did have in mind that I wanted future generations. I want to keep telling this story for all the reasons that we've been talking about. We don't want to repeat mistakes, even though we do it all the time. I also think that the sort of reporters who have come to fiction have done a lot of good in terms of their advocacy, like Upton Sinclair and Sinclair Lewis come to mind, and Theodore Dreiser. They had a lot to say politically, but I'm not sure it makes for great literature.
No, I agree with you.
I'm still like a writer. Like, I really care about the literature side of things.
Which I really liked about your book, by the way, that it's a writer book and not a, and I feel the same, by the way, about the visual arts or film. The stuff that lasts is not, put it this way, I paint and I write and I do artsy stuff, and I've done it all my life, but I've never gotten up in the morning when painting a painting and say, what do I want to say with this painting?
Yeah. I mean, and
It's another expression. Or, and of course, music means something, and Hitler liked Wagner, and and on and on
yeah.
and on. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think the good art is generated from the point of view of how do I put propaganda more easily and adaptably so that people
Yeah.
will. I mean, do you agree with that?
I do. And I mean, to your point, about the Nazis, I mean, part of the Nazi psychosis was they were literally orchestras playing
Yes,
for
absolutely.
prisoners getting off the trains about to be murdered. I mean,
Yeah.
and the guards at Dachau went to the opera at night. It's like this mania for culture, and that's like about, stealing Jewish, making a museum of hopefully all the dead Jews is what they wanted of
Yeah.
their art. It's so psychotic. I can't really, there's no explanation I can come up with because I can't understand it. But I do think that we we still need our culture. There's absolutely fabulous new book that came out 2 days ago that I'm going to review in the post. I mean, my
Mm.
review is in the can. I'm not sure when it's running, but it's by Jeremy Eichler, Eichler. He's the classical music critic for the Boston Globe. I never remember book titles, but
Yeah.
if folks who are listening can Google it, who tries to address these points. What is
Mm.
music doing for us? And I can't quote him accurately, but it's basically music is our memory and the arts
Mm.
are our memory. And they are a way to speak through works of art, are ways that can speak through generations to future generations when we're not around. And
Mm.
that probably is a very important role for art, even though, as I said, I'm not a good art theorist, but I agree with what you said.
But from the point of view of what you just said about this book you're reviewing, and by the way, I have a book I want to draw to your attention that I'm preparing to interview somebody about that I think you'll be interested in a minute. But one thing as a writer anyway, and maybe, I'm 71 years old and I come from, I cut my first novel was published, I think, in 1990 and so forth and so on. So I come from a generation where you got hand marked manuscripts back from editors, in the digital age, and it's pre that. But
Yeah.
I don't think that I just, and I'm asking for your opinion, this is not a loaded question, but what do you think about sort of submitting past works if art is the historical memory we have, good, bad, or indifferent? It is the memory. I have a real hesitation with sensitivity readers changing the language in past works. I don't think it's a service to future
Yeah.
generations, or trigger warnings in books. The idea that somehow you should repair the past, at a certain point, edit it to suit the present, I just think is a very slippery slope. And I'm not sure. I just wonder what you think, because you're a reviewer and you're a literary person. If 20 years from now, somebody says, Martha's written a book where, unwittingly she did some whatever cultural appropriation or whatever, so we're just going to put trigger warnings or edit a bit of it.
So yeah, I definitely have a lot to say. Yeah, I'm really not in favor of editing works that have been done. I think we should still be reading To Kill a Mockingbird. I think we should still be reading Huck Finn. I'm 100% in favor of discussing those books in the present context about what is problematic here.
Yeah.
I think the problem is who's the chooser, who's making the choice. I don't believe in book banning anything, and yet I came to publication for my book, and I'm also not a big fan of trigger warnings because I don't really understand them. I'm not from that generation, but I did feel I was open to criticism if I didn't put a trigger warning on. We have a choreographer who is abusive, and some see him as a pedophile, and so I insisted to the publisher that they put a trigger warning on. Meaning this is an abusive choreographer, it's on the back jacket, that's the language, and then the reader can make the choice. I hope that we will continue to educate our young people about all kinds of literature, and then there's one more thing I want to say. I'm working on a third novel. It has a strong lesbian protagonist and a strong Black protagonist, and I am very enthused and in favor of sensitivity reads. I don't like that word. I had it out with a couple of sets of readers not for censorship, but because I'm not that person. I want to make sure I'm doing justice and I'm not stereotyping. And our aim is to bring full humanity to our characters. I feel that we are permitted to write about whatever we want, but we have to do it respectfully and giving them full humanity. And there's a beautiful essay by Zadie Smith, the famous British writer, on this. I think she says it really well.
Hmm.
We need to write about people other than ourselves, or our work would be really boring, but we need to be respectful and do our homework.
Yeah, and I agree. Many years ago, the first novel I wrote was set in Italy called Portofino, because we used to take vacations there. This is back in 1990, and I remember one of the reviewers in the UK, I think it was in the Guardian, said that they loved that they assumed when they read it, they assumed I was a British writer because I got the dialogue, the British voice correct. Of course, I went to boarding school in the UK, so there's a little bit of a cheat there, but I got the dialogue, and it was I think a woman reviewer saying in particular something about the dialogue of the character Jennifer, because that's a real English girl. And it's amazing to find out Frank Schaeffer's an American writer. At that point in 1990, she didn't add, and a male writing in a female voice, albeit told from a little boy's point of view, writing about another 11-year-old. And I always felt that was a very high compliment.
Definitely.
And today, people would be saying there might be a school of thought that would say something like, what is Frank Schaeffer at that point in my life, a 30-year-old something male writing in a young woman's British voice? And I feel that if you followed the logic of that out to the limit, art and literature would by necessity die. In other words, why is in other words, there would be no voice but your own in the book, and fiction would be gone altogether because you couldn't people it with anybody. And you would have to prove you had every experience you wrote about, and you could never have anything but your own gender from your own racial background voicing anything. And I just have never seen how you can play that out to a logical conclusion and have anything at all left in the way of any literary output. I don't know your feeling on that. And but it's something that I think is very troubling in terms of younger people. And I'm just thinking, when I sat down to write my novel Portofino, not only did I not say to myself, what am I trying to say? I just wrote a story, which I then read out loud to my wife at the kitchen table, and she enjoyed it. And that was the first sign it was worth doing. But I wasn't saying to myself, I'm not Italian. How can I write in the voice of the Bagnino, who's an Italian? It was good enough for me that I'd enjoyed the beach as a child and had been on the beach in Portofino, in Paragi next to Portofino during those years. I never once stopped to ask myself if it was appropriate for me to set a book in Italy when I'm not an Italian. Well, I don't understand how anything can happen anymore if people are getting that. And I think a lot of young people are absorbing that lesson. And they get more and more and more frightened about saying anything about anything, because am I paranoid about this?
Well, I don't know how to generalize about young people. I feel
we'll talk about your kids. Where are they at?
I mean, my kids are they actually have mixed feelings about trigger warnings. We've had a lot of conversations about that. I'm not sure we would line up, but I think the whole point of art is imagination, and we need to access our imaginations.
Yes,
I think there is some, if I may say, push by some negative elements in our society to overdo what's going on with trigger warnings and to overdo the appropriation question. It's easy to mock. And I feel very strongly that we absolutely have to come to our characters with utmost respect and empathy, and we have to do our homework. And I think we as writers are should be subject to criticism for writing with a tin ear. We need to be learning from our peers who are different from us. So I am very much in favor of readers, of having readers who look more like the people I'm writing about, give feedback. That feels very right to me. But there's this whole, and so I think it's about respect and humility, and I also think it's about, we want to bring humanity to everybody, and also it's bad literature to have two-dimensional characters that are stereotyped and bigoted, so I guess I'm not, I'm a little worried. I'm less worried. I don't like the cancel culture on either side of the aisle.
Right.
And I'm a little worried about everything in America has to be so binary. And I just think life is complicated. It's nothing about life is binary as
Yeah.
far as I can tell,
Yeah,
except
exactly.
maybe computer code. But I think we need to have a more nuanced approach. So I
Yeah.
wish the conversation were more respectful. I really
Yeah.
do. Because, yeah.
Yeah, I hear you and I agree. Let me reintroduce you and pretend this is a podcast and not just a conversation, because I
Thank you.
actually, talking to you for the last 20 minutes, I literally forgot what I'm supposed to be doing here. This is, oh, other people are listening to this. What did I say? In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer is the podcast. I am Frank Schaeffer. My guest today is Martha Ann Toll. Her new book, which is also a novel, is Three Muses. She is also a wonderful critic. And I'm going to change gears here for a minute. I've read a number of your reviews, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but at least the reviews I've been reading of yours have been ones where you seem to like the book and find something worthwhile. I don't think I've read something of yours where the purpose of the review is to torpedo a book. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, and I once heard a wonderful program by a couple of Washington Post reviewers who felt that their job was to bring people to a book and, open the audience for the book, which I see as my job. I've had one or two times when I hated the book so much that I declined the review because I don't want
Yeah.
to be in a position of trashing it. But
Yeah.
you can see, if you see me reciting a lot of plot and not giving a lot of opinions, that means I didn't like the book as much. But I try to find something affirmative in everything I'm doing. And if I think there are weaknesses, I try to point them out. But I'm not in the business of trashing authors. I don't think it does us any good. And I also think it is, I love books. I want more people to read books. So
Sure.
that's the way I see my position.
Yeah, the reviews that I've always liked best of my stuff have not necessarily been by people who only do that. Like I remember in the Washington Post, actually, it was one of the reviews I enjoyed most of a book of mine a couple of years back was by the novelist Jane Smiley, and she wrote a long piece for the Post on a book. And I always like that when a writer's writing a review, because they know what it's going to be like for the poor sucker reading it. And basically, I don't think Jane would review a book she doesn't like. Let me talk about a book that I'm very interested in, because I'm just reading it now, called the Pulitzer Saga, if I'm saying it right. If you can read that. Am I saying that correctly? And it ties into something you were saying. It's sort of a stunning story about a woman who was raised Roman Catholic, devout Roman Catholic in Baltimore, finds out when she's 28. This is not a novel. It sounds like a novel. It isn't.
No, there are a lot of stories like this.
Finds out when she's 28 that her parents had changed their name and never told her that she was Jewish.
Yeah.
But more than that, they had done that originally, and this is where the plot thickens, because she's being raised as a Roman Catholic, not because first the Nazis were so cruel to her family, which they were, and they killed them. But before that, the Hungarian Roman Catholics were so viciously anti-Semitic that when the Nazis first arrived, even the SS officers in Budapest were shocked by the viciousness of the Hungarian anti-Semite Catholics that were doing the job of the Nazis before the Nazis arrived. And she then goes back, and it's a book full of family photographs and so forth. And there was one box of papers in the attic, and the house burned, but the box was preserved. I mean, it really has the flavor of a work of fiction. But anyway, the book is in bits and pieces, basically recreates people who's not only were killed in the Holocaust and by the Hungarians, whose lives were totally lost, but who were obliterated from history. Mm-hmm. And she fortunately found a translator and someone to help her. Anyway, this is sort of very circuitous, but first of all, it's a book that when somebody sends it to you, you should write about for a couple of reasons. One, because recovered memory of one family is a huge deal. Right. And I just was so struck by that. But the other thing is that, especially in a moment of a rise of anti-Semitism, bookended by the perfect storm of a far-right group in Israel pushing the country like in a direction that basically fits every stereotypical worst imagined thought from the left as well as the right, not just the right, the left.
I think it's mostly the right, but yeah, I'm with you.
Both.
Yeah.
So her family actually turned out to have been a very influential Hungarian family that knew the Soros family, that had done business with the Rothschilds. In other words, all the stereotypical go-to name. Okay, so it did something for me that's interesting, and this is a little bit risky to say, but I'm going to say it. And that is that I am someone sort of the left who reads a lot of the criticism of Israel from the left. And basically, I've spent a lot of time in Israel because of documentary films I made, ironically, from the point of view of evangelicals who were saying, you know, that the fulfillment of prophecy proves we're right. You know how crazy that gets. In other words, the Christian Zionist movement in America is more Zionist than the Zionist movement ever was. I mean, there's so many layers of insanity there. That's a different discussion, and you know all about it, people like John Hagee in Houston and others. But this book was really corrective for me, because it was like, you know what? Step back for a minute and just look at how the memory of this one family was obliterated through the family shame that then changed their name just to survive, and then carried that instinct of survival into the US, where actually they were safe, but had been so hurt, like the character in your book, Three Muses, who has trouble continuing singing in a way because he's been forced to sing for the Nazis. Well, there's a weird tie-in here, and I didn't mean to go there when I was talking about Three Muses, but it's just too much on the nose to avoid. And that is, you know, he brings this burden of having sung for the Nazis. She is a 20-year-old devout Catholic who finds out she's Jewish, and then when she discovers her family history, the very church she's going to in America is the same church that in Hungary persecuted her family into the ground, and is why her father changed his name and said he wasn't Jewish to survive before the Nazis arrived.
So I have
a big story.
Yeah, it's a big story. It's not the first story like that I'm familiar with. There's an author named Helen Fremont who's written extensively about this. She lives in Boston.
Yeah.
She couldn't understand why her family went to church every week and then left before communion, and all her relatives came to family holidays with tattoos on their arms. But anyway, so two things. I have a bunch of things to say if I could take a minute here.
Please do.
First of all, even though it's incomprehensible, there's a huge amount of shame in surviving when your country turns against you and you thought you were a loyal Hungarian Jewish citizen. But there's also terror. Being Jewish is associated with terror. Anti-Semitism is thousands and thousands of years old, and there have been pogroms throughout history. My father's side came to this country because of the Ukrainian pogroms. My mother's side was German, so that's a different story. But anyway, the pogroms we can talk about 11th century England. There are a lot of them. So, that's 12th century England. Anyway, so this doesn't surprise me. So there's this horrible shame factor, and then there's this incredible desire to lose the past and start something new, which is what her parents did. So in my book, each character is renamed. John was originally Yanko Stein, and when he comes to America, he chooses the name John Curtin very consciously because he wants to put a curtain over his past. And many Jewish people, myself included, are unable to trace our ancestry because there was so much name changing going on. Sometimes it was intentional to hide the fact that you were Jewish, and sometimes it was Ellis Island. But anyway, we've all had a million name changes and we don't know who we are. And that is very disconcerting and deracinating and disrooting. I want to tell a personal story. I was in Seville in southern Spain, which was a very, very Jewish city. There were 800 years of Muslim rule in southern Spain on the Iberian Peninsula, which was a great flowering of both Jewish and Muslim scholarship, living mostly peacefully together. So we happened to be there during Passover, and we went to the tiny, tiny Jewish museum, which is, I'm sorry, this was Cordoba. I was also in Seville. This is a Cordoba story.
Mm.
Cordoba is where the great scholar Moses Maimonides was from. He sailed from there in the 1300s. So there's a tiny little museum to him. It was the first night of Passover, and we asked if there was going to be a Seder, and this Spanish guy says, yeah, we're going to do it in the basement of this house, this 13th century house owned by a Jewish merchant.
Mm.
And in the gathering were, an Israeli music student, a French whatever, and a large number of Spanish Catholics. I say a large number, this was quite a small gathering, but the leader of the Seder had recently learned that he was Jewish. So for listeners who don't know this, 1492, which we have recognized in America as one date, is a catastrophic date for both Jews and Muslims. It's the year that they were expelled from Spain, where they had been living for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Mm.
And the choice was either you leave or you convert. So that group of people called conversos, so many Spanish names like Fuentes, that we think of as Spanish, Espinosa, are actually Jewish names.
Mm.
So there's a movement in Spain, this is what we learned at our Seder, of reclaiming your Jewishness. And there was a fellow at this Seder who was literally the keeper of the keys of the cathedral in Cordoba. I keep saying Seville, it was Cordoba, which is this magnificent cathedral that's built within what was a mosque. And he said, I'm the keeper of the keys. I would have been running the Spanish Inquisition, which murdered, Jews and Muslims. And I'm found out recently I'm Jewish. So this idea of losing your Jewishness or holding on to it because you have to, you're going to literally be executed.
Mm-hmm.
It goes way, way, way back. And there's definitely a movement in Spain to recapture this. And I think it's true for a lot of people here. We saw it with Madeleine Albright, for example.
Yeah, sure.
It's a very famous example of that.
Yeah.
So I definitely would like to read this book. And it's fraught, and the name changing is complicated. When I talk about this, I also talk about African Americans who often hold the name of their enslaver, which, if you think about it, is a travesty. It's just a total travesty. So how do you reclaim what your name was if you don't know what it was, and all those things?
Yeah, there's a tiny connection with my family in that we always wondered if my mother came from a Jewish family on a very weird basis, because her family was from Scotland, but her family name was Seville. Mm-hmm. And a lot of Jews were forced, like Muslims were, to take a Spanish surname, last name rather. And a lot of the Jews just took I'll take the city, the name of the city. And after the Armada that got wrecked on the shores of the UK, that according to the British Christians led by Queen Elizabeth I was an act of God, as they were driven up towards the Scottish that shore, and a lot of the Armada were wrecked by the storm. They then, of course, nobody's catching an airplane back to wherever you came from. A lot of them just went ashore and stayed. And mm-hmm. So, what's somebody called Seville spelt as the town doing up in Scotland. So, we always had this thing that, okay, somehow that might be the case. But to get back to the point here on people renaming their families and so forth in this book that I'm talking about, but also, somewhat in your own background, and then this trip to Cordoba and so on, it kind of brings up a point, of reference to where we are today as a cultural social critic and someone who's a writer. In the novels you're working on now, because you said you're working on another book now, but did I hear right when you said two more? Well,
I have a book that's under contract. It's called Duet for One, and it's coming out May 2025. And it is very much about the classical music world, but it's also a study of grief. It's the main character has lost his mother, and on page one, the father of the main character was in a two-piano team with his wife, a worldwide two-piano performing team, and the mother/wife dies on page one. So they each have their own separate grief. The father has lost his profession as well as his spouse, and the son realizes he's emotionally bereft because his mother wasn't really there for them. So it's the son's love story, but it's deeply about music, and it's about grief. Also.
Speaking of the musical thread, because obviously I haven't read the book, and by the way, get this one to us early, because I know that
Okay.
The book we're working on, Three Muses, has been out for a while. This one, let's get the copy from
I'd
the
be
publisher.
thrilled.
Get
Yes, I'd
me
be
the
thrilled.
early one, hard copy. Get Ernie the actual book because I like to underline. I don't like reading on a
Okay,
screen.
will do. You're on.
And then
Thank you.
we'll do it in a timely way that actually helps launch it, not like a year
Thank
later
you.
after the fact, like some poor person sympathetic reviewer comes out a year late and $1 short.
I would be honored, but this is the way we're celebrating the 1 year anniversary of my book. So
Okay,
I'm
good. We have
thrilled
something.
that you're part of my 1 year
Yeah, and in
anniversary.
the old
Thank
days, it
you.
was always, oh, well, it's coming out in paperback. Okay, we'll do that. But these days, everything's paperback. But in any case, let's jump in early on that one, Ernie, and get it to me in a way that we can actually be part of the launch. But which brings up a point, since there's the thread of the music running through it, aside from the fact that you did ballet and your parents and so forth, I grew up weirdly. My dad, we lived in this evangelical commune where our house was swarming with students. I climbed over sleeping bags every day. Literally, if I wanted to go to the refrigerator and get a snack at night as a child, it was just normal to have people lying in the hallways and sleeping. It was a kind of a hippie commune before there were such things in the 50s and 60s. But my dad didn't like the racket of all the students downstairs when he was doing his Bible studies and sermon and lecture preparation. So he played classical music, full volume, 24/7. So the funny thing is, I know the classical canon. There's almost nothing that I ever hear that I don't know who the composer is. Now, since I wasn't in there reading the LP sleeves, sometimes I can't necessarily, plus I'm dyslexic for real. I'm very bad on names. But if I hear a little piece of music, in my head, I know exactly what comes next because I know, so Prokofiev, it doesn't matter who it is.
Right.
And I've passed this on to my children and grandchildren on purpose.
Yeah.
Okay? He didn't play it night and day through the walls of a Swiss chalet that reverberated wood. You could hear it as if you were in the speaker. But anyway, it was a great gift. And then my mom, bless her, who was this evangelical Christian, also had this very high view of the arts. I mean, you were talking about this odd thing where the Nazis have orchestras playing when you get off the train at Auschwitz. My parents were very countercultural to their own movement, as in they were evangelical Christians, but her idea of what you saved money for was to buy classical season tickets to the Montreux Classical Festival.
Nice.
So I grew up seeing people like, Yehudi Menuhin and I knew all of them. So like for me, these were household names when I was a child. And later it was like, my granddaughter the other day, Lucy, who's 15 now, came back from a school thing saying, I'm the only person in my class, that knows that it's the fourth movement of the ninth, where the choir kicks. She says, my teacher was saying, huh? And she says, nobody else even knew that, and so I was kind of that kid. In boarding school, they would do musical appreciation. It was like, well, of course, I know this is Vaughan Williams.
I was in law school when Glenn Gould died, and I was like, I have nobody to tell this to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the feeling. So now let's dive into the new book, but also to some extent, the one we're talking about, Three Muses, because one of my big things is, I don't look at literature as political first. And I know, I'm sorry if this sounds really sentimental, but I think that art is beautiful. It doesn't necessarily mean sentimental beauty. It can be hard truths. But if you lose sight of the fact that somehow it has to be beautiful, the writing, lyrical, then, and I like that about your writing, and that is you don't have any shame when it comes to trying to make the writing beautiful, but also the lyrical aspects of the story, and then working in a respect for art in general, capital A, and music. Just talk to me more about your own relationship with music.
Thanks. Well, it's so funny because my dad did the same thing, but not because he would just like shower in the morning and his door would be closed, but he always had the music up full volume.
Yeah.
So I learned, he had very eclectic taste. So I learned a huge amount from just listening. And then we would play a little quiz when he would take me to my music lesson, what's on the radio. I usually get like if something's comes on, I can usually tell within 5 bars what it is.
Yeah.
But so I flamed out in ballet. That's no surprise. Most of us do. And I ended up in my mother, I've one of 4 girls. My mother wanted a string quartet, and that was very intentional. exceptional. She was very deprived in her own childhood and wanted to be able to give this to us. So I'm the third kid, so she had a violin and a cello. She needed a viola. So I started on viola. I wouldn't have done that otherwise. But I ended up through her good offices in the hands of a mentor, Max Aronoff, who changed my life in really profound ways. He was in the first graduating class from Curtis, which is always has been tuition free. It was endowed. It's based in Philadelphia, and for music aficionados, it's sort of the place. It's like, not Juilliard, it's better than Juilliard, but you have to know that to know that. So Max was in the first graduating class and founded this string quartet, Curtis String Quartet, and I was, studied with him for years. He was just this incredibly amazing personality. But the thing that he did that was so profound was disentangle performance, and so that he would teach you, like, reverse engineer how to practice. And as surprising as this may be, most music teachers are very bad at teaching students how to practice, and it's all about practice. So I basically fell in love with practicing. I mean, by 10th grade, I was practicing 3 hours a day. And it was just he had a beautiful, beautiful sound. I mean, it was an incredible education. I played very, very seriously. When I went to college, I thought that I would be a professional violist. I played in orchestras, quartets, performed all the time. So I have a deep performing background. I was a music major in college. And partway through college, I began to really feel some restrictions in that, I felt like my ear was better than my fingers, and a lot of frustration and a lot of negative other things happened. And I realized that words were kind of my thing. So I didn't go into music, which in my case was a blessing. I think I would have been very frustrated, but it made such a deep imprint, not only the sound. And when I first started writing fiction, that was my number one goal, to get music on the page, which, if you think about it, is impossible. And same with ballet, very temporal, very fleeting mediums. How do you get that on a page which can last? So that's always a challenge when I'm writing. And the second thing is the life lessons of what like when you're practicing 6 hours a day, what are you doing? And how are you understanding the music? And that, like, carried me through law school. It was like all these life lessons that are really important, like, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? And what is the, make sure every note sounds beautiful. Don't put garbage out into the world, no matter what your assignment is. And I'm talking about assignments at work, bring your best self, all the focus and concentration and discipline. I mean, it was just life altering for me. And I still carry it with me. I'm not playing anymore, but it's still super, super important to me, and fraught, as you saw in Three Muses, and is also true in Duet for One.
And did you find, as a parent with your daughters, I felt this sort of compunction to pass this on, even though in a way my mother was very intentional. My dad just played the music full volume to drown out the students, but he liked it. And he would wear his records out. It was like, well, what should we give Dad for Christmas? And well, he's worn out his Mozart Requiem again. He's worn it out. He's worn it out again, because these are LPs. Oh, he needs a new one. Funnily, just total little crazy footnote. The only thing, because jazz and rock and roll were evil, we couldn't play that. So I grew up on the classical canon with an exception, and that is that his friend Hans Ruckmacher, who taught at the Free University of Amsterdam, was writing the jacket copy for the Decca jazz albums, because he was a jazz expert. And he introduced my dad in the 40s? Yeah, in the late 40s to Mahalia Jackson.
Oh my God.
So I would have, and I loved her. She was my rock star, because she was the only thing that had a beat to it that we had in our house. I mean, a non-classical beat. So, we would be Mozart, Bach, and, and then it would be a Verdi thing and a thing and a thing and a thing. And then all of a sudden, Mahalia Jackson blasting for both, double.
I love that.
The only Black music I knew was Mahalia Jackson. And then later I realized, no, there are other people too. But as a child, it was like, there's Mahalia Jackson.
It's really funny. I was like just nerdy. Like, all my friends were classical musicians. All my peers at undergraduate were classical musicians. So I did miss a lot of popular culture. So you asked about my children. I did start them on music, and they were in basically open rebellion. And I felt I needed to listen to them. I mean, they had some years of classical education, and
Right.
then and they're still kind of mad at me about that. What they're really mad at me about is that there was, you could at least play the Beatles, Mom. Like, why
Yeah.
aren't you playing this stuff? And Daddy never plays anything written after 1500. Like, what's your problem? So they feel that they suffered, not mainly because we had no, like, neither of us are great on popular culture. They're making up for it. They go to concerts all the time, but it wasn't really their thing, and I didn't want to impose it for a lot of reasons, having to do with my upbringing. But they both are artists. My older daughter's a professional theater director. My younger daughter is a really, really gifted potter. So
Hmm.
they have the art thing happening, but it came out a different way.
Where's the theater directing going on?
So her name is Lila Rachel Becker. She's based in New York and she's freelance. So
Excellent.
her next show is going to be in North Jersey. Yeah.
And she's managed to earn a living at this,
No, she has a day job like like
like
she's
everybody
a theater
else.
director. Yeah, she has to
Let,
have a
let
day
me
job.
getting back to the one novel. So you're writing another novel now, but did I hear wrong when you that I thought
Yeah,
there were
I'm
two things in the
I'm
works?
I'm have a first draft of a third novel that
Okay,
I'm
good.
a
That's
little
why I
reluctant
got the
to talk
third from
about.
you.
Yeah, but
Well, that's
it's
a relief to me because I liked your book, and I also think that it's a shame. I was hoping it wasn't sort of some odd sort of one-off, like you've done all the criticism and now you want to write one of your own. And I hope it's a career change. I think this is what you ought to do, which brings up a question. Has it dented your capacity to write things for the Washington Post and other people? Are you doing more of your writing than their
well,
writing?
fair enough. I had a full-time job till 2020. So
Mm.
that was like a train wreck, basically. I was writing and doing full-time social justice work, and that was a train wreck. So I left that job unconnected with the pandemic. It was sort of coincidental. So I am writing full-time. So I actually have more time to do reviews, but I'm actually probably doing fewer of them because I am trying to really go all in on the
Yeah, work
fiction.
on the book. And you get
Yeah.
up in the morning and work when you crouch over your
Yes,
coffee
I
table. I
do.
know you. Yeah.
I mean, it's funny, when I had a full-time job, I was so much better at this. And, then you're like, don't have that same structure. I've tried to write every day, and promoting a book has been, as you know better than I do, very, very time consuming.
Yes,
So
it's crazy.
my schedule is cuckoo, but when I look at like if I go back at the end of the week, I've done what I want to do, but not necessarily on predictable hours. I
Mm.
would rather be that person I was like 5 years ago, but
Yeah.
life's a little more unpredictable now. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But I always fit it in, and I always, yeah, I mean, and one of the things I like about book reviews is you have a deadline. So you're doing
Yeah.
some writing on deadline and some writing where not really on deadline. So
Yeah, and is your husband's social justice, or rather, yeah, not environmental stuff, does it
Mhm.
overlap with you, or you just sort of go to separate rooms and do your
No,
stuff?
we go to separate rooms. He's remote, and I keep saying that since the pandemic, I now know what he does for a living.
Mhm.
But yeah, we don't usually, yeah, we meet for dinner. Is really what happens. We
Yeah,
don't
well, that's
usually
sort of,
talk to each other during the day.
I get that routine. My wife and I are both self-employed and we do our own thing. And of course, we're both old enough now. So, you can kind of describe yourself as retired, although that's become sort of a joke in the sense that I'm busy doing
Yeah.
things. But, and we happen to be, as you are, in professions where if you keep enough of your marbles to fool people, you can keep going.
No,
But you
I
got to
think
have
it's a great gift. I think it's a great gift.
yeah, you got to have somebody like Ernie, my producer here, who's doing this podcast and who also
Yeah.
does all sorts of other things for me because he makes it appear as if I still have my shit together. You see
I'm
what I'm
sure
saying?
you
So it's
do.
like because he he won't post all the commentary I send him. He edits some of it, or he'll just say, "No, we can't put this one out there." You still have to have some friends, whatever. So at some point, you may need to collect an Ernie to help you. I'll tell you where it helps is in this ridiculous world we're in now, where nobody gives a shit about anything except what your online footprint or something.
Yes.
You need all this stupid stuff. Have you run into that in trying to promote your
Yes, and
novel?
I have hired some help with that. I mean, my feeling is if you don't have a teenager in your life, you have to find one, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah.
Somebody who can do all this stuff. Although
Yeah.
Ernie's not a teenager, but he's one of
Oh, I
these
understand.
remarkable mid
That
to
was
late.
metaphorical, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah. He's a graphic designer and a designer and an artist who actually is good at this other stuff too. So,
It's great. That's
we get a
wonderful.
lot done. But in any case, before winding down here, is there anything about the three muses that, other than we'll link to it and do all that stuff, is there
Thank you.
anything that we need to say other than somebody ought to read the book. It's lyrical and beautiful. And if you like music and art and history, this book is for you. But other than that,
Thank you. Well, what I always like to tell people is I love meeting readers and I am thrilled to Zoom into anybody's book clubs. I have loved doing that. I've loved connecting with readers. My contact information is all on my website. My website is my name, Martha Ann with an E Toll. And so I love hearing from folks and I love talking to folks.
and we will link to that. And I would encourage book clubs to do this book because it's a book that has enough music, history, drama, love story, passion in it, so that it's a book that, forgive me if I missed that, but you don't have any sort of discussion notes at the end, do you? For book
I
club?
have it on my website.
Okay,
So
because I didn't see anything in the book itself, but then I was reading an online copy. So did I miss that, or are they around?
No. On the book page of my website, there's a page called Book. There are questions for book groups. So
Okay,
that's
because I would
another
encourage book groups. It's a very book groupy book.
I
There's a lot of
appreciate
stuff
that.
there.
And I just want to take this time. I have totally loved this conversation. Frank, you're just like a terrific person to talk to. And I want to thank you for everything you're doing with your life. It's so meaningful. You're a real
Thank you.
role model.
And I
Thank you.
hope we talk again about all sorts of stuff. Speaking of which, by the way, little thing here, just like I brought you this book that I hope you take a look at, the Pulitzer
Mhm.
Saga, which I think will be worthwhile for you to review. I hope if you run into something that you feel passionate about that needs to be better known, that you get in touch with Ernie, my producer,
Wonderful.
and say, Frank really ought to interview fill in the blank.
Okay, great.
It doesn't have to be an author. It can just be social justice, environment, person. You know, we do all sorts of people, and we're very
Wonderful.
interested in the same things you're interested in. So please allow us to
Thank
help
you.
someone you think needs help or should be
Thank
promoted.
you. I would be so honored to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, and then also please keep us in the loop on your second novel.
Oh, I'm thrilled. I will. It's coming out in May 2025, and you will definitely hear from me. What a wonderful opportunity.
In April 2025, we will be pushing the hell out of it.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate
We'll get
it.
ahead of it this time.
Okay, thanks a million. You be well.
Martha, this has been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank
You're
you.
a lovely person to talk to. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.